Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. So, as this is the first time you've more or less gathered all together after the sports event, which I hope you all enjoyed, I'd like to say a few quick words, first of all, before we invite you and welcome you formally tonight at the opening ceremony. We hope you enjoy our exciting program and allow yourselves to be inspired, not just by our very talented array of speakers, but also by each other. And we are very, very proud to introduce to you our conference patron, Kumi Naidoo. Kumi has dedicated his life to the struggle for human rights and environmental justice. From his anti-apartheid activism in his youth, to his help in helping to organize the first free elections in South Africa in 1994, to his time as International Executive Director of Greenpeace, where he continued to take part in oil rig blockades, he has been at the forefront of the social justice movement. Currently, he is leading the organization Africans Rising, whose campaign to integrate Africa-wide movements for social change and peace and solidarity launches officially on the 25th of May. We are very grateful for the support provided to us by Kumi and his team so far. Today, Kumi will give a rather pessimistic outlook on the world, but a bunch of optimistic suggestions for how it can be made better through practical action. I'd like you all to join me in welcoming to the stage Kumi Naidoo.
Thank you, Andreas. Oops.
Yep.
Thank you, Andreas. Friends, colleagues, dear brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, I must start with a bit of a confession, and that is I'm desperately jet-lagged, I'm somewhat sleep-starved, and these days, I think there's an issue with the sound. Are you hearing me okay? Okay. But these days when I speak to any audience, I'm more nervous than I was when I was 15 years old when I got involved in the liberation struggle in South Africa. You know, when I was 15 years old, I didn't fully, like many of you, when you were 15-year-old, you didn't understand lots of what was happening in the world, but if you live in a terribly unjust society, even at a young age, you can actually see it and you can actually understand it. So, for example, the first protests I participated in, I was in the front as a 15-year-old leading 1,500 students protesting against the inequality in education based on racial prejudice. And the slogan at the front of the march, which we were confidently shouting, was, "We want equality." But then the slogan got to the back of the march, the younger kids were chanting, "We want a color TV." Because kids in white schools had color TVs and kids in black schools had no TVs. And I felt very confident even at that age, but today when I stand in front of you, I am filled with kind of doubt and trepidation actually. And maybe I'll tell it to you in a story. I was addressing an audience in the United States about 3 years ago, and when it came to the question time, I had quite a violent response from one of the delegates. Not physically violent, but verbally violent. Because in that speech, I was just looking at the state our world is in today. What I described in a book in 2010, Boiling Point, Can Citizen Action Change the World? That what we see happening at the moment is a convergence of a range of different crises, peaking and maturing at the same time. So we've had a poverty crisis for a long time. We've had an inequality crisis for a long time, but the inequality crisis is getting deeper and deeper and deeper. We've had a gender inequality crisis. The climate crisis is also mounting up and up and up and getting closer to the cliff. And so I went on like this, and then especially when I went on to the environmental catastrophe that we face. Because, dear brothers and sisters, as we sit here, every 2 seconds, a forest the size of a football field will disappear. And I went on to talk about our oceans, where, according to Times magazine, Newsweek, a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, they said, they did a special study on oceans, and they said, all that will be left in our oceans if we continue the way we are, in 40 years' time, will be algae and jellyfish, because of the triple whammy of overfishing, the dumping of toxics, including oil spills, and overfishing. And ocean acidification, of course, which is more and more carbon in the atmosphere, less and less forests, and that excess carbon is going into our oceans, turning it into acid. 40 years' time, most of you hopefully will be alive. I think I would have checked out by then. But you who like fish, you've got a problem. So as I was talking and running through the statistics, just as some of you now, I'm looking at your faces and you look very concerned. This audience was extremely concerned in New York some years ago, and when the question time came, a very upset woman put up her hand and said, Dr. Naidoo, have you heard of Martin Luther King? And I said, yes, I did. He inspired many young people like me in the struggle for liberation in my country and my continent. And they said, do you know what his most famous speech was called? Anybody? Okay, now I sounded like how you all sounded in answering the question. A little bit nervous. I think it's a trick question. And I gently said, I have a dream? And she shouted back at me. She said, yes, it was I have a dream. But when I hear you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare. The oceans are collapsing, the forests are collapsing, everything's collapsing. So one of the challenges of leadership in the moment of history that we find ourselves in is how can we speak truth to power? How can we speak in a way that does not sanitize that in fact we are in a deep systemic and structural crisis, and where our leaders, both political and business leaders, are kidding themselves and kidding all of us that in fact when they stand up and speak, they actually have real solutions to the problem. Because to a large extent, what our political and business leaders are doing globally is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while we are sinking. What we are seeing is baby steps in the direction of the kinds of changes that we need. What we see is incremental tinkering with problems without addressing some of the fundamental challenges that we face. So, since I quoted Martin Luther King, I'm just going to ask for Martin Luther King to be brought into the conversation, because when I was 4 months old, Martin Luther King gave the speech. And he was talking about, in 1965, and he was talking about the state of the United States. But what he said in 1965 is much more applicable today in the United States. How many of you from the United States here? Okay, I'd like to know how it reflects to you. But not only is it pertinent to what's happening in the United States, but it applies throughout the world. So, over to Martin Luther King. Hopefully, the technology does not let us down.
Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word in psychology. It is the word maladjusted. It is the ringing cry of modern child psychology, maladjusted. Now, of course, we all want to live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But as I move toward my conclusion, I would like to say to you today, in a very honest manner, that there are some things in our society and some things in our world for which I'm proud to be maladjusted. And I call upon all men of goodwill to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to racial segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few and leave millions of God's children smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society.
Get my voice back. So let me just repeat the last bit. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. Now, you can go back in the United States and other countries and you'll find there were people in leadership much earlier who, even in presidential leadership, like President Eisenhower, warned us about what he called the dangers of the military-industrial complex. And today we can actually broaden that out and call that the military-industrial fossil complex. Because if you haven't yet realized, the people that have more power in this world is not our elected political leaderships, but the CEOs of oil, coal, and gas companies who are, amongst others, big pharma, big pharmaceuticals, military, and so on. But I have been upsetting a lot of my friends in the United States over the years when I've been saying to them for about 15 years now, I've said the United States is not a democracy, that the United States is a liberal oligarchy. It has the form of democracy, elections, without the substance of democracy, right? And that is why that system can deliver a fascist like Donald Trump. And by the way, I have no hesitation in calling Donald Trump a fascist. That's what he is, and we have adjusted to the fact that he won this election through fraudulent means, and I would urge you to actually read up what we understand by classic fascism in the way that we experienced it in the Second World War, and now look at modern-day fascism. And Donald Trump is an archetypal, classical fascist as far as most of us in the developing world are concerned.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. So what we have is a system, and by the way, I'm using the United States as an example to start off because not that this is not a problem that afflicts many, many parts of the world today, but because the United States puts itself forward as the promoter of democracy, the advancer of democracy, and so on. So those who say that I stand for something and I'm promoting it in the world and so on should, of course, be held by a higher standard. I mean, we can look at Russia, for example, and, just because you have elections in Russia, clearly the political will of the people is not necessarily coming through, and we will never know because of a problem that we all, me included, make. And let me tell you the mistake that we make. Because, quite often we think that governments and corporations control people by the deployment of what you can call the repressive state apparatus. By what I mean by repressive state apparatus, it's your army, your police, formal laws, and so on. But actually, much as the repressive state apparatus in many countries around the world today take many lives, constrain what citizens can do, and fundamentally, actually, increasingly constrain the freedom of association, the freedom of assembly, and the freedom of expression, the bigger threat we have, actually, is the ideological state apparatus. By the ideological state apparatus, I mean the framework for religion, the framework for schooling, but importantly, the framework for the media environment. Now, I want to just do a quick experiment. How many of you have seen, at some point in your life, CNN International? Please raise your hands. Keep your hands up, please. CNN International, right? Yeah. And Americans would have probably seen it when you're traveling, right? Yeah. CNN International. Please keep your hands up. Sorry, please keep your hands up. Straight up. Okay. Now, those of you who have your hands up who've seen it, CNN International, once or twice or whatever, When you saw it, were you left with the impression that CNN International is a left-wing, radical, or ultra-liberal news source? How many of you think it's any of that? Keep your hands up. Those of you who don't think, when you saw it, right, when you saw CNN International, did you come with the feeling, wow, I'm looking at a really radical, left-wing, ultra-liberal news source? How many of you, if you think that, had that impression, keep your hands up. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so most of you who saw it don't think that it's a radical, left-wing, liberal, progressive news source, okay? But now, those of you who sometimes get frustrated with our brothers and sisters in the United States for voting for a guy like Trump, for example, I ask you to stop for a moment and understand that the people in the United States are as much victims as they might be perpetrators of foreign policies that many of us actually find objectionable. Because here's a story in the United States. The US citizens don't see CNN International. They see a conservative version of CNN International called CNN Headline News or just CNN, right? But when you look at the ideological spectrum of mainstream media in the United States, on the left, you got MSNBC, and this watered-down version of CNN International is considered on the left. And then, of course, on the right, you got Fox and others are in between. So understand that today, the main means of control that is exercised in the world is, in fact, what kind of information impulses that are coming in your direction. What kind of information you are receiving, how you're receiving it, who controls how, in fact, you receive that, and so on. So, it's not surprising that there are lots of cross-ownership, like in Russia, for example, Gazprom, the gas and energy company, is one of the biggest empires in Russia, right, in terms of media empires, right? If you go and look at other countries, you'll see that, in fact, big owners of media companies that determine what you and I think, right, are in fact advancing various agendas which are about, I would put it bluntly, economic exploitation to a large extent. So within this context, I want to ask you another question. Does anybody here have a sense of which is the most devastating disease we face in the world today? Sorry?
Financial system.
Okay, financial system, very good. Global warming. Sorry, I said disease, eh? Okay, but you... Measles. Okay, measles. Measles is a very serious disease coming from Africa, I can tell you. But we had financial system, global warming, malaria. By the way, those of you who don't know, malaria takes more lives in Africa on a daily basis than HIV/AIDS takes. Zika. Zika is also serious. You saw what happened in Brazil. Mental health. Cholera. Cancer. Okay. So folks, some of you were in the ballpark of what I was looking for, especially the first ones who so influenza is also a very big problem. It's not, in terms of numbers of people affected, even though the impact is not as bad as cancer or HIV/AIDS. But I want to suggest to you that the biggest disease we face in the world today is a disease we might call affluenza, right? Which is related to the economic system folks who are shouting there and global warming. So what do I mean by affluenza? Affluenza is a pathological condition where people at the top of society have developed a tendency not to know when to stop accumulating. Right? They've come to believe that happiness comes solely from the acquisition of more and more material things. Ironically, many of those material things that actually they don't need at all. And quite often, some of those material things actually doesn't in any material way actually enhance their quality of life. So those of us at the top of society can talk sometimes, I'm very concerned about climate change. A lot of people will tell you I'm very, very concerned about climate change and so on the one hand, but lead completely overconsumptive lives that cannot be justified by any means and by any sensible sort of argument, right? So we need to understand that it's very easy to say, I'm opposed to poverty, right? Have you ever heard one person in your life saying, or academic or speaker saying, poverty is a fantastic thing? Any of you heard that? No, it's easy to say poverty is a big problem, but one of the reasons why there is so much of poverty in the world is because of an immoral level of inequality in the world, right? Because it's the poor that actually are subsidizing the ultra-consumptive lifestyle of the 1% of society. Now, 1%, is not necessarily the exact percentage, but symbolically, that was one of the contributions that the Occupy movement gave to the world when the financial crisis hit us, when people were saying, come on, we got to think about one planet that we live on, how do we manage to share this planet in a more equitable way? Now, I'm looking at you and I'm seeing very sad faces. So let me give you some good news. Now, you probably would hear environmentalists like myself at some point or the other say things like, save the planet, save the environment, save the climate, and so on. The good news, dear brothers and sisters, the planet does not need saving. The planet is absolutely fine. Why do I say that? Think about it. What would be the consequences of us continuing on the suicidal trajectory that we are on, the suicidal path that we are on, where we continue our reliance on dirty, brown, fossil fuel-based energy, oil, coal, and gas in particular. And we chop down our forests. And now, I must be honest with you, right? Growing up as an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa, I grew up with the understanding that environmental activism, or environmental concerns, let me say, was what rich people and white people did. Right? Because in South Africa, white people treated their pets and so on 1,000 times better than they treated black people, right? So I, growing up, we even had swear words for environmentalists. Tree huggers, bunny huggers, and all of that. But today I've come to realize how wrong I was to actually read things like that. Because when we talk about protecting forests, it's not about whether you like forests and trees and the nature that's there. That's part of it. But today we must understand that forests are the lungs of the planet, right? All the pollution that we put there, particularly carbon, forests actually store that and keep it safe, right? So within this context of climate change, which I'll say a little bit more about later, what will happen now if we continue to warm up the planet, we run out of water, we're already in Africa running out of fertile soil in certain countries because of climate-intensified desertification and climate-intensified drought, right? And Africa is a hot place to start with. Hot in many ways, by the way. Our culture is hot, our people are hot and all that, and our weather is hot, right? But the end result, what would it be? We will be gone when the water and the food and when land to grow food runs out. We will be gone. The planet will still be here. The planet will be bruised, battered, and scarred by humanity's crimes on it. But truth be said, once we become extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So don't worry about the planet. The planet will take care of itself. Understand that when we say we need to avert catastrophic climate change, what we are saying is that humanity needs to fashion a new way to coexist with nature in a mutually interdependent relationship for centuries and centuries to come. Put differently, this struggle is fundamentally about protecting our children and their children's futures. Now, when I was the head of Greenpeace, I'll tell you a funny story. Whenever I had to meet with CEOs of big companies to lobby them or to pressurize them to change the way they were doing business, there would be a research team who will go and look at all their products, how the products are produced, and so on, and they would give it to me. But before I would even read anything, I would ask them sometimes, please, don't do anything illegal, don't do anything invasive. Just check on the internet whether this person has children, whether this person has grandchildren, find out the ages for me, find out the names for me, and find out also whether they're in the first, second, third, or fourth marriages. Now, I'll tell you something. The rate of success I had with CEOs who were in the second or third or fourth marriages, who had young kids, was significantly better than I had with CEOs who didn't have kids. But even when they had grandkids, because I would say in those meetings, sir, what will Sandra say in 10 years' time to you? How are you going to respond when Sandra, your 14-year-old daughter now, 10 years from now will say to you, Daddy, when the scientists said we needed to act, when extreme weather events were telling us we needed to act, because in the last 10 years, if you haven't noticed, in the last 10 years we've had 100%, more than 100% increase in extreme weather events, right? I mean, just think about it, especially the older folks here. Just think about, you know, when you watch television these days, right? Just the normal news. You don't have to be a rocket scientist or, you know, you can even be stoned or half drunk and watching the TV news, and you could be able to figure out, you'll be able to figure out that, in fact, we are seeing much, much more extreme weather events happening all over our planet. So we have to be clear that what is at stake here is humanity's survival. And as young people, my special message to you is, understand that you are going to pay the price for the absence of bold, courageous, principled, adult political and business leadership that we don't have in the world today. Understand that the people who are making the decision, Donald Trump can stand up and say climate change doesn't exist, it was a Chinese plot and so on, right? He can say that. He's not going to be here to bear the consequences when water runs dry, when our soil is destroyed, and when food is not available, right? You are going to pay. And how many of you, okay, I'm going to ask a personal question now. How many of you in this audience are planning to have kids? Just put up your hands. Okay, this is a bit of a personal question. Great. I thought more of you would have such plans. So understand, I mean, think about what the morality of that decision you have to make. By the way, let me just say to you that as a father myself, one of the most amazing things in the world is having a child in your life. You know, when Nelson Mandela came out of prison after 27 years, and all the people that went to prison with him, about 12 of them, for about 26, 27 years, when you asked them, what did you miss most being in prison for that long? All of them said, we missed the sound of the laughter and the crying and the noises of children, right? So don't feel apologetic about, in this messed up, fragile, fragmenting world that we live in, that you would have a desire to have kids. But I upset my elder sister tremendously recently when she came to a meeting, and I forgot she was in the audience, and I also forgot that she is somebody who sells, like, you know, insurance policies to people, like people who want to secure the children's education. They take an insurance policy so that every month they pay some money, and then, you know, when the kids make it to university, then they have this policy that they can pay for the university fees. So as I was talking to you, I forgot my sister was there, and I said, if you really care for your children, don't worry about education, insurance policies, or any other policies. And I just saw my sister go. And what I was saying is you need to understand fully what the climate catastrophe we're facing means and become a climate activist. The most important insurance policy you can take right now to support your children's future is actually become a bold climate activist. So, but how do we do it? And now I'm going to be a bit critical about the environmental movement. But in being critical of the environmental movement, I think this criticism can apply to the human rights movement, to the gender equality movement and others. And that is, one of the problems is in our response to these multiple crises, you know, economics, politics, human rights, etc., what we call civil society, which is, you know, NGOs, trade unions, faith organizations, and so on, operate far too much in silos, right? We think that climate change is one issue, human rights is another issue, unemployment is another issue, etc. If we fail to understand the connections between each of these different things, we fail with all of those things. Now, the women's movement actually, more than 25 years ago, gave us a very powerful concept, but a terrible, cumbersome word. Anybody knows what that word is? Now, feminism is cool. Feminism is not a difficult word as such, right? But it's in the same ballpark. Okay, intersectionality. Anybody heard that word before? Yeah, I'm not surprised that less than 10 of you have heard it. But what the concept behind intersectionality from a women's movement perspective was saying, if we are going to address gender equality, then we needed to understand how gender intersects with race, class, ability, religion, and other things. That if you don't ask that question, you don't go far. So I'm going to tell you a story about why we are failing on climate change and why we are not way ahead where we need to be. And that is partly, you'll be shocked to hear this, partly it's a problem of the environmental movement. Because we have spoken about environmentalism as if it's like something locked in a box and stands on its own for far too long, right? You know, I myself, when I was recruited to Greenpeace, they approached me because of my being trying to bridge these silos for a long time before that. And part of what is happening now, a bit late, is to make those connections. So Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, asked me to come and support him in 2010 in Hollywood to speak to the producers and the filmmakers and all the people in the movie industry. And I didn't understand why he had asked me first. He said, you know, come, we need to reach out to these people because they have huge power. So anyway, I go there. And remember what I said about the ideological state apparatus, right? So I go there and then apparently I'm not very good with movies and movie stars, but apparently, you know, there were lots of famous people, which I'm sure most of you will know who they are, you know, icons in the movie industry. And so eventually, I was on a panel where I said, you know what, we need you folks in the communications industry to help us speak like human beings, help us to use less jargon, help us to actually humanize what climate change means. Otherwise, we're never going to get our messages through. And actually, to be honest, we don't need another Al Gore type of documentary right now, like Inconvenient Truth. Because what happens is when you do that, the people who are converted already are the ones who are going to see that, right? We need kind of communication tools out there that are reaching new audiences and so on. So I give them an example, and I'll share this example. So in 2009, 2 weeks after I started at Greenpeace, I had to lead the Greenpeace delegation to Copenhagen for the climate negotiations in 2009. So the first thing I had to do was sit with my Greenpeace colleagues around the table to prepare for the different tracks of the negotiation. And within the first 5 minutes, I had to turn to my colleague sitting next to me 12 times to say, what does that acronym mean? What does that mean? What does that mean? And then after a while, I thought, my God, if I keep asking them what do these, these codes mean, they're going to think, where did they find this idiot to make the head of Greenpeace, right? So then I decided to stay quiet, and then the next thing I hear was a term called LULUCF, LULUCF, LULUCF. I'm sitting there thinking, my God, what is LULUCF? Is it a country I didn't hear of? Is it a town I didn't hear of? Is it a chemical I didn't know? Anybody here knows what's LULUCF? I'm glad you don't, because that will mean your life is very sad if you know what LULUCF is. So LULUCF stands for Land Use Change for Forestry. And I tell this audience, they laugh a bit, and then I say, I wonder which genius came up with that. And then the next person to speak after me was the then chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Dr. Rajendra Pachauri from India. And he said, I think I need to start with a confession. I think I came up with that, right? So the bottom line, as an African, I can tell you, we are never going to move our people to embrace strongly the fight to make the changes that we need in terms of addressing climate change if we cannot present the argument that addressing climate change does, if you do it well, include creating decent jobs. If we don't, if we simply say we want to shut down everything, we want to shut down oil industry, coal industry, gas industry, right? And if we do not talk about how do we transition those people in those industries to clean energy jobs, for example, very difficult, not easy to do, but can be done, right? If we cannot talk about the just transition from an economy that is driven by dirty energy because we cannot, ethically, we cannot punish the working people that work in those industries. Those were the jobs that were available. They have actually powered our economies. They are the ones that allow us to drive and use the things that we do. And we have a responsibility for us to transition those people, retrain them in new jobs and so on. And that is the scale of the kind of solutions that we need. So let me begin to conclude by saying that, that was a very nice, generous introduction that Andres offered. But just to keep myself honest and also send you a message about where you put your faith, let me just say this, tell you a small story again. So when it was December 2007, I was in Ethiopia for the trial of two friends of mine, Daniel Bekele and Netsenet Demisi, who were held under completely false and pretense and unjustified basis. And on December 24th, I was sitting in the court after 3 years of lobbying to get them out of prison. And somebody is translating from Amharic to English in my ears, and I'm sitting there like everybody else in the court thinking, wow, these guys are going to be acquitted. And then right at the end, all the things were sounding like acquitted, and then suddenly the guy he says all those things, and I find them guilty. And then 2 days later, they had to come to court on 26th of December 2007 to hear how many years they were going to go to prison. But we had all assumed from what we were hearing that they were going to be acquitted. So I was going to spend Christmas with my daughter, who was then 12 years old. So I had to call my daughter from Addis Ababa and say, darling, I got a problem. I don't think I can make it for Christmas because the families, the mothers and the partners and the brothers and sisters of my two friends are completely devastated. They had been waiting for almost 3 years for them to come out of prison, and they now will be sentenced tomorrow on 26th of December, so I want to stay with them and be at the court. So she says, no, it's okay, Dad, I'll see you when you get there. So when I see her 2 days later, she said, Dad, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you are very crap at your job, aren't you? That's not a nice thing for any parent to hear. Huh? So I said, darling, what do you mean by that? She said, no, you've been fighting for human rights when you were 15, democracy when you were 15, gender equality, climate change. All of these things seems to be just as bad as it was when you were growing up, and it seems to be getting worse. So basically, when I look at you, I see you as a complete failure. I mean, she didn't say it as roughly, that I'm exaggerating for effect. But think about it. Was that not a fair observation? I think it was a fair observation. And that is why we must remind ourselves of what Albert Einstein once said. He said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting to get different results. And that is why, after Greenpeace, when I went back home and I was asked to help lead a new African-wide social movement that will be launched on the 25th of May, called Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity, in a very different organizational strategy. I won't go into the details, but I would strongly invite you all, whether you come from Africa or not, that you should read the Kilimanjaro Declaration. It's just 1 page long. You just Google Africans Rising Kilimanjaro Declaration. It lays out a very different way of thinking about how we organize. I mean, not the declaration, but if you get onto the website, you'll see a vision document. So for example, young people in the movement are saying, we don't need a physical launch. We don't need to have a conference to launch. Let's launch through activities. So on the 25th of May, there's not going to be any conference. There's going to be activities taking place all across the continent. People are going to wear red to remind ourselves of the people who gave their blood for our liberation through the struggles against colonialism and so on. And also, the key part of it is to try to recognize that most of the countries in the world, in the parts of the world that were colonized by Europe, historically, like especially in Africa. How many of you from Africa, please raise your hands? Okay, keep your hands up, and because I'm going to make an outrageous comment, and let me see whether you agree, right? I think that the majority of countries on our continent do not make economic, cultural, linguistic, environmental, or any other sense. That our countries only made, the boundaries that we have, only made sense in terms of a European colonial mindset. Because bear in mind, I don't know if you know this, but the boundaries of Africa were drawn up in this country in a conference in Berlin, right? So I ask you, those of you who think that I'm crazy by saying that many of our countries don't make sense. Okay, so one person thinks I'm crazy, and that's fair enough. Right. No. Sorry? Oh, you agree? Okay. But here's our problem. Even though we can think that, we live in a nation-state system, and we have to work within that system. But what we must say is we must rise above that system, right? We don't have to be stuck into divisions that didn't make any sense to start with. So yes, we can respect the nation-state system on the one hand, but for example, if we are thinking about building a major concentrated solar plant, why can't 3 countries get together where they share the boundaries, share resources, pool together their capabilities and do one plant, for example, which can service 3 countries at the same time? Just as a simple example. So I've been jokingly saying, and by the way, the reason I was approached to play this role was because ever since Europe adopted the euro, I've been saying, if Europe can have a euro, I don't see why Africa can't have an afro. And I'm not talking about the hairstyle. The hairstyle is very nice, by the way, and I'm disappointed to see none of you have afros here. Anybody has afro? Okay. So I want to conclude with 2 points. What does history teach us about when humanity had a major challenge, injustice to address? I would argue that the most important lesson we can take from history, whether it was slavery, whether it was colonialism, whether it was a woman's right to vote, civil rights in the United States, and apartheid, any other struggle, those struggles, dear brothers and sisters, only moved forward when decent men and women stood up and said, enough is enough and no more. I'm prepared to go to prison if necessary. I'm prepared to put my life on the line if necessary. And I want to suggest to you that the moment of history that we live in must be one where we are unapologetic about exercising our right of civil disobedience to disagree with the trajectory that our political and business leaders are taking us down. Now, there was a reference of me going to the Arctic, and I can tell you, I participated in 2 protests, one in the Greenlandic Arctic and one in Russia. And in Russia, there we had a situation, you can see it on the website and YouTube if you Google, you go into YouTube and you say, up against Gazprom, right? For 15.5 hours, we were facing a water cannon, and most of my family and friends back home were saying, Arctic, what has the Arctic got to do with Africa and with us? And you are too old for this kind of stuff, right? But I must confess to you, I'm not a good swimmer. I can't climb very well. In fact, they sent me to a Cape Town rock climbing school for a 1-day crash course, and then I was doing this. I was, as we eloquently say in South Africa, I was shit scared, right? But what kept me going was recognizing that even if the Russian authorities used guns against us and killed us or whatever, a year later, some of you might remember, 30 people were thrown in prison for the same action for about 3 months in the Arctic prison in a place called Murmansk. But it's very important that the lesson you can take away from that story, and by the way, I got attacked by some other leaders of NGOs who said that that is not a kind of thing a head of a big international NGO should do, right? And I feel very strongly that those of you who should aspire and take leadership, right? If you're in leadership position, you cannot send young people and other people to go and risk their lives, and you sit off in your office and sort of write reports and do media interviews about it. Good leadership, and I'm not saying on the other end that if you're a leader, every day you have to be in the front line, right? But I'm saying that there are times in which leaders must step forward and say, my life is not any more important than a young person going and taking that same risk. Something that, for example, all our military establishments, particularly the United States political leadership, will send young people to go give their lives, but their families are not in the front line. There's very, very rare exceptions where you'll see the politicians who make the decision to send young people to war, that their children are also there on the front line. There are exceptions, but it's very, very rare. So the key message I want to leave you with is this. You will hear people of my age and older and a little bit younger say to you, young people are the leaders of tomorrow. How many of you have heard that phrase? I want to say to you from the bottom of my heart, you've got to resist that very, very strongly. Because if you wait to take leadership tomorrow, there might not be a tomorrow to take leadership on. Right? You need to understand that my generation of leadership, even in the civil society side, have run out of fresh ideas. As young people, your lenses, right, are fresher. You can look at the world in a different way. I'm not saying, by the way, that nobody in my generation has good ideas, but as a mass or as a critical cohort, you're getting the same things thrown at you all the time. And again, my daughter was very helpful about 10 years ago when I was trying to discipline her and tell her, darling, based on my experience, you shouldn't be doing that. And she said, Dad, your generation, y'all are always talking about experience, but y'all have been contaminated by bad experience that hasn't made the world a better place, and now you'll keep pushing that bad experience on us, right? So I want to really, really say to you that young people like yourselves must now develop the confidence and the capability and the knowledge and the courage to take leadership and not wait for the future. Because if you wait for that future, there might not be a future, essentially. So I'm going to end with a story. It's a personal story. It's a true story. It's a sad story, but it's not to... I want you to focus not on the sad part, but on the inspirational part, and I hope you can do that. So when I was 22 years old, I was fleeing South Africa into exile. And I had a conversation with my best friend at that time called Kumi Naidoo, same surname, no relation, also fleeing, but we were fleeing in 2 different directions into exile because the police and the army had been looking for us for several months, and we'd been living underground, and our families were coming under terrible repression and so on. So he asked me this question in the last conversation I would have with him. He said, Kumi, what is the biggest contribution you think we can make to the cause of humanity? And I said, that's a very simple question. Giving your life. And he said, you mean going, participating in a demonstration, getting shot and killed, and becoming a martyr, for example? I said, yeah. Now, that was happening in South Africa on an ongoing basis at that time. Every other week, we were in funerals burying people who had been killed by the security forces. And usually, at the funerals, other people got killed, and it was like a cycle. So he says to me, no, that's a wrong answer. It's not giving your life, but giving the rest of your life. Now, I was 22 years old that time. My friend Lenny was the first environmentalist I knew, and I jokingly say that I have it under reliable authority that at that time he was only one of 5,000 voluntary vegetarians on the entire African continent, to make the point that he was way ahead of his time. So, we hugged each other, we shed tears, and we fled in different directions. 2 years later, I get the news that my friend Lenny and 3 young women from my home city were brutally murdered by the apartheid regime. There were so many bullets in their bodies, the parents couldn't recognize them. Now, of course, as I got that message, and I was on a, believe it or not, by then a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford University, so I'm in this luxurious place, in relative terms, and I get this message, and I had to think deep and hard about that distinction between giving your life versus giving the rest of your life. And in that lies a very inspirational message, right? What Lenny was saying is the struggle for justice, economic justice, social justice, climate justice, gender justice, indigenous people's justice, whatever issue you're working on. These struggles are marathons and they're not sprints, right? He was saying the most important contribution we can make is to have the stamina, the perseverance, and the energy to stay true to the cause until those injustices are eradicated, eliminated, or addressed. And that is the best commitment we can make. Now, to you who are starting off in your lives, some of you I know have probably already done great things. Some of you are planning to get involved in various issues and so on. I want to say to you, don't let anybody ever say to you that your contribution and your efforts don't matter. Because that's part of the message of the ruling classes around the world. To actually say, yeah, you can go do your thing, they'll never shake our power, right? Don't accept that. And just think about this. I know, how many of you here raised money yourself to buy your tickets to come to this conference? Please raise your hands. Oh, I thought it'd be more people. Okay, some of you got freebies. Good for you. Okay, the very fact that there are people who would choose to raise money or get the parents to help them or use their savings to buy a ticket to come and sit in a week-long conference on how we make the world a better place is a testimony to me that you've taken a very positive step, right? So I want to say to you, and this is where the inspiration of that story comes from, you will face many, many days where you will feel pessimistic. I do, right? I wake up sometimes and I'm in the morning and I look at my schedule and I think what I'm going to do and I think, oh my God, is this all going to add up and make the changes that we need to make? And I have self-doubt. And doubt is not a bad thing, right? Doubt is much better than actually foolishly believing you got the solution and you're bumbling away and causing more problems in the process. So what I want to say to you, the fact that you are here, you've dedicated a week, the fact that some of you have already done wonderful things in the communities and universities and so on you come from, is a source of optimism. The world will be a much more pessimistic place were it not for people like you who are searching for solutions, who are searching for the answers, who are wanting to say that I refuse to accept that the world we live in today is the best world that humanity can create for itself. So within that context, let me leave you with a quotation from Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi once said, first, they ignore you. Then they laugh at you. Then they fight you. And then you win. Now, if Gandhi was right, the worst thing would be is if, as you contemplate what activity you're going to be doing moving forward in your countries, your communities, and so on, that you accept, the worst thing would be if they ignore you or they laugh at you. But let's be clear, those that have power around the world are fighting us, and they are fighting us hard. Every week, according to Global Witness, a think tank in London, 2 environmental activists get killed when you average it out. Every week, 2 people get killed, right? We know that thousands of people are in prison for standing up for justice across the world, right? So I'll say to you, the moment that we're in, the fact that those with power are fighting back so hard is not fundamentally a bad thing. Because if Gandhi was right, we are 1 step away from winning. The worst thing would be if they were ignoring and laughing at us. The fact that they're fighting us in multiple ways, take it as a sign of optimism, and take it as a sign, hopefully if Gandhi was right, we are 1 step away to creating a more equal, a more just, a more sustainable, and a more peaceful world. Thank you very, very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Kumi, for your somewhat realistic and humbling, but also very inspiring words. Now, next we're going to be taking questions. We have about 50 minutes for those. So, yeah, I just asked anyone who has a question to raise their hand. I think Kumi will pick some people.
Andres, what I would slightly amend that, if that's okay. We have 50 minutes is a long time. So if people also feel they want to make a short comment, I think we can allow it, no? Yes. Please. Is there somebody running around with a mic? Great. So put your hand up again. Young woman with the red shirt in the back.
Hello. I have a question. Okay. Yeah, I have a question regarding your Afro comment. Like, do you think? Okay, it's really uncomfortable with this. Is it okay if I just speak without the mic?
No, we can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
Just hold it a little bit further. Yeah,
it's
that's
really
good.
okay.
Yeah.
So you were talking about the Afro comment, like Euro and Afro. So do you think it will ever happen, because there's so many conflicts in Africa right now, and especially countries are dividing. I think Sudan just divided into 2 countries. What do you think is a solution to solve that problem right now?
Thank you. Very good question. So the first thing to say to that is, therefore I said, I jokingly said, if Europe can have a Euro, why can't Africa have an Afro? It was more to actually, it wasn't about the specifics about one common currency, even though I personally believe it can be done. It can't be done overnight, and it might not, if we try to do it now, it will be a disaster. But laying the basis for that might be the right way to go. But really, it was more about trying to promote the idea of African-wide social, economic, and political integration. Having said that, though, there's a wisdom from Nelson Mandela that I would like to share with you. Mandela once said, "It always seems impossible until it is done," right? Now, that particular example is a good example to say to you that you might adopt a position and take a view on things that the status quo understanding would say it's unrealistic, impossible, and so on. But I ask you to just reflect on this. Once upon a time, the first people that stood up and said slavery is wrong and it must be ended were told, you're unrealistic, you're never going to sort it out because the whole cotton industry and so on will collapse in the United States and whatever the examples might have been. The first people who stood up and said women should have a right to vote and women should be treated as equal, they were told, how unrealistic is that? You're just, living in cuckoo land, right? When I was growing up, and I said we need to take, to my family and the people around me, I said, I'm joining the struggle because we need to bring down this apartheid regime because it is so fundamentally unjust. My family, close elders in my family, and similarly with other people, our families were telling us, but do you realize the apartheid army is the strongest army on the continent? It's supported by the United States, it's supported by Britain, it's supported by other powerful nations, and you little small person here, you don't even have a school leaving certificate, you're gonna take on this regime. So what I'm saying is that if you go back and look at history, the people who stood up first and said an unpopular thing, right, eventually, over time, those things become mainstream. So if you take Martin Luther King, 41 times he went to prison, right? If you take Nelson Mandela, 27 years in prison. If you take Rosa Parks, the woman who refused to sit in the back of the bus in the United States, she went to prison. If you take, sorry, there was another person I was going to bring in, Martin Luther King. Oh, Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi was in prison multiple times. Today, let's look at how history records them, right? In India, Mahatma Gandhi is like a, semi-god, right? There's a big, observance and so on. Is his birthday a national public holiday? I don't think so. It is. Okay. Martin Luther King, his birthday is a national public holiday. And the monument they have in Washington, D.C. for Martin Luther King is as big as any other president of the United States, I believe, right? And of course, Nelson Mandela is the only person in the history of humanity that every country in the world at the United Nations level agreed that on 18th of July, his birthday, should be declared as a day of public service, right? It was not controversial. All I'm saying is that sometimes you need to step out with an idea that actually sounds ridiculous to the majority of people. But if you have a logic and you have an understanding of why that can work, right? Even if you have doubt, my advice is don't hold back. Don't not articulate an idea or a solution because the majority of people with power or in the world think that it's a ridiculous idea. It might be a ridiculous idea in the end, but don't let the fact that people say, oh, you'll never achieve it, be the reason not to do it. Thank you. I think I need your help, Andres. Andres and I had a conversation to be transparent about whether I can just have a free-flowing conversation, but there are too many hands up, so I think I need your help to just help me decide.
Yeah, I've got to weed out maybe someone near the back. Are you there?
Is there only, oh, and there's this gentleman with very nice shorts and t-shirt.
Hello. First of all, thank you, Andreas, for the right choice.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Thank you, Andreas, for the right choice. And thank you so much. Do you hear me? Thank you so much for your lecture. I really enjoyed that. In the beginning of your lecture, you started talking about environmental problems. And I believe that your point of view is more comprehensive than we possess. We've been hearing a lot of theories how our world is going to be like, how our nature is going to be, how we are going to live, and when we cease to exist. And with those tendencies going on in the nowadays, what would you say? When can we really fight those environmental problems, if at all? Or it's going to be our permanent problem? So what is your opinion?
Thank you very much for probably the most toughest question one can be asked, actually. Thank you. And I'm going to answer it in a very personal way, right? So I don't often do this, but I've been very moved working with Andres and his team preparing for this, about the vision behind what you're trying to do here and the kind of parameters of the inquiry. So I'm going to take a risk and be quite personal here. So when I was 15 years old, it was a big year for me. My mom committed suicide. And it was a very cataclysmic event in my life. But even though she left us at a very early age, she taught us some very important things, which helps me deal with this question. So the first thing she taught me was, it is much better to try and fail than fail to try, right? So when people say to us, it's too late, you know, forget it, the climate is screwed, the planet is screwed, we're all screwed, I'm opting to take my mother's advice here and say, I'd rather try and fail than fail to try, even though I must be honest with you, in my most pessimistic moments, I look at the data from the scientists, I look at the extreme weather events, frequencies and so on, and I am freaking out, right? But I refuse to not continue to fight, and that is what I'll say to you, that it's your future that is at stake here. You know, there are some climate scientists, privately, not publicly, have said to me that the best that humanity can do right now is actually try to be as compassionate with each other as we disappear as a species, because we left it too late, right? So understand that we are 5 minutes to midnight. But since I raised my mother, let me just tell you 2 other wisdoms from her. One was, she said, it is, you know, in a world, because one of the issues that keeps us apart, unfortunately, is the issue of religion. And I want to say, when I look at you, I get a sense that this is a religiously diverse audience. And I want to say that, because one day one teacher who had converted from one religion to another religion was saying to us, oh, you know, my religion is the best, and da-da-da-da. So I go home very depressed and said to my mother, you know, it's my favorite teacher, he's telling me this is the best religion, and I'm not that religion, and blah, blah, blah. And my mother said, listen, all religions are essentially the same, right? But the most important religious philosophy you can have is see God in the eyes of every human being that you meet, right? And I think if many of our religious leaders followed my mother's example in their proselytizing, the world would be a much better place. If we cannot see the humanity of God's creation and we like thinking that one is more superior and another is inferior and so on, it's what's driving us to. So I think unless we can recognize our shared humanity, we are in deep trouble. And the third thing she said was, you know, don't bother with criticizing people all the time, and because there's not much you can do about the weakness in others, but there is something you can do with the weaknesses in yourself. So what I would say to each and every one of you is always challenge yourself. And you probably got it from me that I'm in a state of crisis, actually. I'm challenging myself. I'm listening to what my critics say, what my daughter says, even what Donald Trump says, and trying to see, you know, have we got it completely wrong, and trying to be better. Because let me just say something to you, and I'll come specifically to the climate thing now. The one thing we must be very careful of, I know, how many of you are here from the UK? Please put up your hands. Hey, they Brexited it already, even from this conference. Huh? Sorry?
Are there anybody from the European Union except in Germany?
Oh, okay. Those of you from the European Union? Okay, that's about 20 of you. Okay, So my point is, there's a lot of anger amongst young people, especially against people who voted for Brexit. There are lots of anger against from young people in the United States, and not only young people, but for people who voted for Trump. The worst mistake that we can make is to see the people that voted for Trump or the people who voted for Brexit as our enemy, right? You have to actually understand that those people, I know you might be shocked that I'm even saying this, but if you do not see the humanity of those people and how that humanity was manipulated by media and false messaging and fake news and so on, you are walking away from a constituency that we have to actually mobilize and get on side. And I am not willing to give up on anybody, and I urge you, do not give up on people who disagree with your position. Good activism is not about going into a meeting and talking to people who all think like you, and you can agree something and you feel good and you walk out. Activism is about having the courage and the belief that what you believe in, right, is pure enough, strong enough, valid enough that you can go and talk to people who think completely different from you, and ultimately you can win them over. That's what activism is about. Otherwise, it's the same people talking to themselves over and over again. And I can tell you, from my experience, there was a moment in the anti-apartheid struggle, if you went to a meeting about gender equality, you look around, hey, how's it? Then you go to another meeting about environment or about youth development or whatever, and it's the same people. The same people going from one meeting to the other, right? How the hell are we going to make change if we do not get people behind us? And then on the issue of where we are with the environment, we're in a dire state, right? We're in a very dire state. We are 5 minutes to midnight on climate. Our leaders are suffering from a terrible case of cognitive dissonance. Anybody familiar? Okay, so cognitive dissonance is a psychological term. Let me not give you a definition, I'll give you an example. When US troops finally got to Baghdad after the invasion of Iraq, there was this moment where Saddam Hussein's communications director was still doing press conferences in Baghdad. So the journalist asked him, so, Mr. Communications Minister, how long do you think you can withstand American shock and awe power? How long do you think you'll survive in this war? And he stood there and said, what war? What war are you talking about? We are in control. Everything is fine. And then the images behind him are buildings burning, bombs dropping behind him, and so on. So cognitive dissonance is a condition where the facts are clear, telling you that we have to get off carbon, we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we have to make some massive changes, right? Massive changes, right? To the way we think about how we source our energy and so on, but are refusing to act. So the good news, though, is that I would say where we are today compared to where we were 10 years ago, with the exception of Donald Trump and a few people around him, all political leaders in the world, even the leaders of Saudi Arabia right now, who were very resistant because of their dependence on oil, recognize that we have to make big changes, right? Secondly, I think the innovations that are coming out, right, are amazing, right? I'll give you 2 examples quickly. There was 4 Nigerian girls. Anybody from Nigeria? Okay, there was 4 Nigerian girls, 13 to 15 years old, 4 years ago, for their school science project. They were in a team. They produced a generator that can produce 5 hours of electricity run on 1 liter of human urine. Right? Urine, everybody knows that's urine, right? You're either in or you're out, huh? So, okay, whatever you call it in your different languages, right? Human waste. And I'll give you another example. When I was, just before I started Greenpeace, I was a visiting scholar at Uppsala University in Sweden. And the day I arrived, a friend of mine who works for Foreign Affairs in Sweden came to see me. And he arrived half an hour later than he should. Now, coming from Africa, half an hour late is like kind of normal. This guy came there, he was very punctual in that part of Europe. He came there and he spent half an hour apologizing for being half an hour late. And his apology was about why he was late, which was a wonderful apology. He said, no, you know, as my public service, I serve on the Uppsala bus management company, and we are having a big problem. I said, what is the problem? He said, no, you know, we run our buses in Uppsala on human feces, otherwise known as shit, crap, and so on, right? So me, I never heard about this. I didn't know this was possible, right? So I said, really? He said, yeah, we've been doing it for a couple of years. And then I said, well, what's the problem? He said, no, you know, we've run out of shit here in this municipality. So we're trying to negotiate with the neighboring municipalities to get their shit. Because their buses are not run on shit, it's run on fuel. And they like want to charge us so much for their shit as if their shit is so special and so on. Right? So now, by the way, I'm saying to the leaders in Africa, right, I refuse to, because now Bristol in England is also, they have a bus service called the Poo bus, right, using the same technology. So I'm saying to African leaders right now, I refuse to accept that European shit is better than African shit. We have to just get our shit together and turn the crisis of climate change into an opportunity. So there is opportunity if you make the bold decisions, including breaking the divisions that exist historically in the world between rich and poor, north and south, east and west. Because the biggest opportunity, this sounds bizarre, the biggest opportunity that climate change puts before us is we can heal the world and we can unite the world. Because we either get this right as rich and poor countries acting together and we secure the lives of all our children and their children. If you don't act in a united way and break down all these divisions, true, people in developing countries are the ones who will die first, who are dying first, who are paying the biggest price for climate impacts already now, but ultimately, nobody is going to be sanitized from it. You know, Vladimir Putin sometimes says, oh, you know, Russia is a coal country, maybe some global warming will suit us fine and we'll get more agricultural space and so on. But he needs to know that he is sitting on the biggest climate time bomb. Anybody know what that is? Methane. You know, when we talk about climate change, we always talk about carbon, carbon, carbon. You need to know that methane is also a traps greenhouse gases. And in the Arctic tundra, we are sitting on top of a massive methane sink. And with the melting of the Arctic sea ice and so on, melting much faster than the climate scientists thought it would melt. If that methane is released in massive quantities, sadly, if that were to happen, to answer your question, it will be game up. But I would urge each and every one of you, resist the temptation of accepting that it's too late, right? Let's put all our energies to push as hard as we can until, for sure, we lose. But even if we are to lose, history must record that those that were taking us to a suicidal trajectory did not go in that way without sizable numbers of people saying, you're wrong, you need to change. Now, I want to believe that we can win. I'm in it to win. I think we all should be in it to win. But let's just recognize that the struggle is big, it's tough, and so on. But I think I'm going to get this proverb wrong in English. They say when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And I think now's the time for people with decency to actually stand up with courage, with conviction, passion, and with energy to try and actually change the course that we're on. Even though we're in a desperately bad state at the moment, we shouldn't allow that to lead us to a point of pessimism. Sorry, next. Okay, let's get some gender balance. Let's take one question from a man now. Okay.
Thank you for that dose of radicalism. But it's not really a question, but rather a comment on African integration, economic and geopolitical integration. I think somewhat I agree with you saying our countries are not doing a good thing, and somewhat I disagree because if you look at the Agenda 2063, yeah, they are doing something pretty good there. Like recently, they just launched the African passport, which will be ready in 2020. And I also think one currency, I looked at the document, and I think one currency is something that looks possible. And everything like power, energy is something which is documented in the document. And by looking at how they are moving, the AU, how we are moving as the AU, I think there is a bright light to be like European Union. Yeah.
No, thank you very much for that comment, because at one level, I want to say I 100% agree with you. So for those of you not from Africa, Agenda 2063 is a vision of the African Union, which is very comprehensive. There's very little that most decent people would disagree with, right? It is, policy terms, very good. But here's the problem. We have a history, not just in Africa, but throughout the world, at the EU level, at the UN level, and so on. I can take you by the hand and walk you through various UN summits and what our politicians committed to. And the problem we have, there's such a big gap between policy and implementation. Just because, and we have to be very careful here, just because our political leaders put some words down on a paper and say, okay, we support it, that's not good enough. We need to see what actions they are taking to actually realize that. And so, if I can be quite blunt, I'm a supporter of the African Union. I want the African Union to succeed, but I think there are some pathetic weaknesses at the African Union. Firstly, starting with the fact that our leaders can find money for military expenditure, they can find money for war, they can find, like my president, which country are you from? Zambia. Okay, so my president, you probably know because we're neighbors, Jacob Zuma can find money, taxpayer money, to build himself a rural mansion surrounded by a sea of poverty. But our leaders cannot find the money to pay membership fees to the African Union to run the African Union ourselves. Do you know that 70% of the budget of the African Union comes from the EU? Right? So I agree with the principle of your point. And by the way, let's not get too hung up about the Afro. I mean, the hairstyle, yeah, you get hung up with that. Make sure you get it right. By the way, I have a big bias towards Afros, because when I was 22 years old and I was fleeing the country, I had very long hair and a very long beard. And then one playwright who helped me with disguises took me into a hair salon at 5 a.m. one morning before I was going to try to get to the university to write my exams in a kind of secret venue that one progressive lecturer was sorting out. And I ended up having a Lionel Richie perm for about 3 weeks while I was on the run. So I like Afros. But what I'm saying is, yeah, I agree with the economic monetary integration. It's very complex. We need to learn and so on. All I'm saying is that it's just a nice line to pick up people's ambition of thinking about the scale of unity that might be possible. Very difficult to do short term. I wouldn't even try it right now, because there are lots of other basic things that we need to do to get right in the continent. But I hope the African Union will rise up to the nice words it has on paper and make that, reality. So let's hope that the African Union can live up to the promise that was originally there when its predecessor, the Organization of African Unity, was formed. And we chose 25th of May for the launch of Africans Rising because that was declared as a day of Liberation Day or Freedom Day and so on. And here's the thing, be honest now, right? How many Africans in the audience knew that 25th of May was African Liberation Day? 2, 4. Okay, I'm looking here, I'm guessing that that's less than the majority of Africans that are here. Now, those of you who didn't know, don't feel ashamed, because the African Union or none of our individual heads of state or governments promotes this day, because if they promoted it, many of our people would say, what freedom are you talking about? What liberation are you talking about? Right? So as citizens, we are saying we are claiming back this day this year, and this is a day we want to remember the sacrifices that people have made. And let's be clear here. Not only for Africa, but for many other countries. If you even look at Europe, The kinds of sacrifices that was asked for people in Europe during the Second World War, the First World War, was massive, you know? We don't ask of our leaders right now you have to go spend 20 years in prison, that you have to give your life. All we're saying to our leaders, be honest, don't steal, and govern with integrity. And the ask that we make of our leaders right now, not just in Africa, but around the world, in terms of the sacrifices that we expect them to make, is minuscule compared to the sacrifices that earlier generations of leaders were asked to make. And that's why we need to not give the AU or any of our leaders too easy a pass. But on the other hand, I agree with you, we need to celebrate the good decisions they make on paper in a hope that they will, the fact that we're saying, hey, they decided on that, puts pressure on them to get closer to delivering on those commitments, which they're not doing at the moment, sadly. Okay. Okay, where's the mic? Okay, now I'm going to get accused of being biased, but the gentleman with the blue looks like he might be from Africa.
Hello. Actually, I'm an African. I'm from Cameroon. But I study in Turkey.
Sorry?
I study in Turkey.
Turkey.
Actually, I want to agree with you on one point, talking about the climate change. You made mention of the methane around the polar region, which facilitates the melting of the ice. And this is something very important. Now, on the other side of the whole thing, I think that the issue of climate change has been overblown. I'm a geologist to start with. I'm studying my PhD. So I have actually carried out researches and things like that, because there are quite a lot of things that could result in this climate change. For example, we also have active volcanoes that give out the gases, sulfur, methane, carbon dioxide, a lot of things like that. I believe that these things also have to be studied. For example, in the northern polar region, scientists have still not been able to prove whether underneath the ice there is a rising volcano around the Earth crust and things like that, which could also cause or facilitates the melting of the ice. But what they mostly look at are the industries and things like that. The simple reason I think that politicians are blowing these things up is because they want the money. I'll cite some examples. We know about the popular Ebola issue in Africa. If you look at it critically, Ebola came into Africa to weaken the economy of some countries. Where did the Ebola come from? We don't know. But the day the US government, I'm sorry if I'm from USA, but I'm trying to correlate something. The day the US government actually said they are giving out $200 million to support the Ebola, the spread of Ebola, you couldn't even hear much about it anymore. HIV and AIDS, and it also came into Africa, and it was spreading so widely during the time of Bill Clinton, and then the Ebola came and was spreading during the time of Obama, which is also he came into power and people said, oh, probably Obama is going to do a lot of things for the Africans. So Bill Clinton was there when the HIV and AIDS spread so bitterly all over Africa, and Obama was there when Ebola was spreading widely in Africa. But you notice one thing is that whenever they say that a huge amount of money has been disbursed to fight these diseases, it drops. We talk about Ebola. When Ebola was there, what happens is they sent military people to go and help people about this disease in Africa. I don't know if it was the military experts. So it's just something like politicians are blowing this climate change thing up so widely in order to be able to use their own funded organizations to withdraw money from the governments, from the various governments. So they need to look up into all these things very critically. And today in the world, we look at the rich and we say probably the rich are taking a lot of money from the poor people. I don't think that's the case. I would say that I live in Antalya. Antalya is a touristic city. I know of a lot of foreigners who come into Antalya, and most especially those from Norway. In Norway, they have a system whereby you can work for maybe 6 months and you have holidays for 6 months, something like that, I don't know. So most of these people who come into Antalya for holidays, they always take excuses and they say, oh, probably I need rest from the doctor, blah, 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 and they get money, they come to Antalya, they spend it, they go back. A rich man doesn't spend money like that. A rich man works hard 24 hours. And
okay, so you had quite a lot of time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to, thank you, that was really helpful. I just was sensitive about time. You would like to respond to that? That's great. Go ahead. And then, okay, now so after you, I'm going to broaden the conversation because I realize it could become quite Africa-centric, so okay, sure. This is a global conference. Okay.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much. I'm Napari from Ghana, but I also studied in Turkey. And I'm from a village in Ghana, and growing up, I'm from a farming community. We used to farm twice a year, but now even one, the rain doesn't, it's not as normal as it used to be. So to claim it is overblown, I think that is not just fair. Perhaps this is not to challenge, but perhaps you might not have seen it from where you're coming from, but the emissions come somewhere and the effects are felt somewhere. So that wouldn't be fair to actually claim it is overblown.
Okay.
I just wanted to make that comment. And actually I had a question before, so I think let me just, if not, I might not get the opportunity again. I think this is about justice, and I feel like the greatest threat to justice, global justice as it stands now, is terrorism. Because perhaps I might be wrong, but I feel like terrorism is created to divide people and to use it to pursue certain interests, particularly corporate interests, especially in extractive regions that are rich in oil and this kind of minerals. Let's see the Middle East. It has been torn apart. And an impression has been created for us to feel like, even though I might be a Muslim, I see a person wearing veil, I feel scared. Not because I believe in what the media says, but the lies has become so big that we agree with it, we believe in it unconsciously. What is the role of terrorism in tackling social justice, in tackling environmental justice, and what is environmental devastation? I just want to know your opinion on that. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you to both of you, my brother from Cameroon and from Ghana, for their questions. So I agree with what you say that it's not fair to say that it's overblown, but I should confess that I'm not a scientist and I'm not a geologist. And so you probably know more. But what I do know is that the biggest scientific enterprise in the world in history is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's made up of scientists from every single country in the world. And history has shown that in all the reports that they give, because it has scientists from every country in the world, there's a lot of compromise. And even we got Trump there now, but when President Bush was there, he was very much pushing to water down the stuff and so on. So I'm sure you have seen some of the IPCC reports, but I would urge you to look at them all. They come out every 5 years, and I think it's pretty crystal clear. However, he does have a point that some of our governments, right, they salivate when they hear about the Green Climate Fund, right? They're thinking, how can I get money from the Green Climate Fund and so on the one hand, right? But actually, they are not as serious about addressing things. So we've had, let's be honest, we've had quite a lot of resources that have been wasted and stolen by our leaders, which they shouldn't have. On the question of terrorism, terrorism is actually a very, very big issue. And I think you imply correctly what are the drivers behind it. You know, quite frankly, how did ISIS, I mean, I'm constantly wondering, how did ISIS get such sophisticated machinery? I mean, think about the tanks and the vehicles and the sophisticated guns. Who sold it to them? Who's making money out of it? The answer to that question, I'm not going to answer it. The answer to that question is uncomfortable, right? If you look at many conflicts in Africa and who benefits from those conflicts, right? It is a very vicious armaments industry that cares nothing for human rights, nothing for people. Because the problem is we have built up armaments industries with such capacity, right? Especially in the United States and Europe and increasingly in China and India. And they need markets. Unless our political leaders step in and say, this is not how you make your economy grow through generating things that create harm and destroy us. However, I want to end with one study that the CIA and the Pentagon did in 2002, which they gave to George Bush, who decided to bury it because it didn't suit his politics. They were looking at, you know, future trends of conflicts, and they concluded in 2002, over the coming decades, the biggest threats to peace, security, and stability will not come from terrorism, will not come from conventional threats per se, but will come from the impacts of climate change, right? And if you look at the genocide in Darfur in Sudan, for example, we know that land and water, you know, Lake Chad was one of the largest inland seas in the world, and as a result of climate impacts, has shrunk to the size of a pond, according to the former Secretary General of the UN. And so water scarcity, land scarcity together gave you the toxic mix of food scarcity. And that allowed opportunistic politicians to manipulate identity and so on. But again, I would say to you, be careful about not taking a siloed approach, right? It's not as if terrorism doesn't fuel off climate impacts doesn't, you know, feed off failures in governance and so on. So there is a little, I would argue that the context of climate change in Africa is creating a recipe for more conflict because, you know, sadly, if you look at history and the inhumanity that people have shown towards each other through war and conflict, quite often it's about very basic things. It's about water, it's about food, it's about land. And when those things start getting in short supply, right, with also an ever-increasing population, then sadly, we can see a spike of inhumanity rather than humanity, if you know what I mean. So that's why I say we're in a very tricky moment, and there's some difficult choices to make. And we have to, when we look at terrorism, the last thing I'll say, we should not that you are suggesting that because you started doing what I think we need to do, is look at root causes, look at, you know, what's driving it. And let me say, I think the use of religion as the main driver of this thing is very fallacious, very opportunistic, and I don't believe fundamentally that that is the actual driver, right? I mean, yes, that's how it plays out, but it's much more deeper, and I think it goes into who benefits economically, and that often is an overriding driver. Even the ISIS guys, they're living it good. You know, they can say something about pious lifestyles and so on the one breath, but if you look at how they were living until they've now being pushed out, they were living as they themselves described as princes and kings. So it's much more complicated than just one or more religions being abused by certain opportunistic people to advance violence. It is the way you said, and I would invite those of you researching that area, studying that area, to dig deeper in there. Okay, let's move. Is there a mic on this end? Okay, that gentleman there, and then next we'll come to the gentleman with that very sexy hat. Okay.
So,
5 minutes.
Hello. Yeah.
8 minutes? Okay. Right. Okay, so we have 8 minutes, so sadly, we'll take two questions. Okay, 1, 2, and you. 3, okay? 3, okay.
So I'd like to keep it short. Basically, your call for action is quite clear, and your speech was quite inspiring for all of us.
You can hear a but coming here. God, but.
But. So you mentioned cognitive dissonance as one of the factors why people avoid changing and keep up the same thing over and over again. And the other way to avoid making change or making a radical change is some people consider technology to be the answer to all our problems, you know? So what would you say are the limitations of technology? What do you think are the roles of technology in our quest for global justice?
Thank you very much. The next one, can a mic go to the gentleman with the hat? Okay, I was worried about the gender balance, so I promised him, and then I come to you, give you the last one, right? Okay. Technology question?
Thank you so much. My name is Bakari Fari from the Gambia. My contribution would go to the area of climate change. From your explanation, I realized that climate change is a multifaceted problem, that is connected to a whole lot of things when it comes to the causes and the impact it has on the world. One lady asked, the question whether this is something that we would, continue to live with. And in my own opinion, I believe that so long as capitalism exists, climate change would certainly not come to an end. Most of these things, people would disagree with me that capitalism is the best form of economic policy that can drive this world currently. But I believe the current economic dogma and, of course, the liberal economic policies that has been pushed by IMF and the World Bank, this is not something that is actually helping us in terms of fighting climate change. And the reason why I talk about capitalism, because I believe capitalism is a concept that has been driven by greed. The reason, if you look at capitalism closely, you will realize that these are people who would go as far as exploiting every resources in the world without giving a damn to the environmental consequences that would that will come as a result. So I believe if we want to put a stop or reduce climate change, which to many is a myth, we must try to see how best we can control capitalism as a concept and try to come up with an alternative to it. Many believe that things like feudalism, things like communism would not end, but suddenly all of them are gone now. So I believe there's a possibility that capitalism also could, there should be an alternative. Actually, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. The anti-capitalist movement seems to be there. Okay. Quickly, and then can a mic go to the lady? No, there's the lady there. Sorry, folks. I was hoping we get more people, but you'll have a chance with the other speakers over the next couple of days to get your voice in.
Okay. I would pose some institutional questions. You demanded that youth should lead. Youth should leave today. Looking at big NGOs like Greenpeace, WWF, UNICEF, and basically a lot of the big organizations, I have the feeling that it takes until tomorrow until the youth can actually lead. So how can organizations facilitate this process of getting new ideas from the youth? And as a second thing, you showed the problem of oligarchy of media. How can we overcome this?
Thank you. Very difficult question to answer, but I'll do two-liners, please.
Hello. Thank you for your lecture. First, my name is Taqwa. I'm from Algeria. I have just a small question. Do you feel that all the people around the globe are equally responsible for the global climate repair, or should wealthy countries bear more of responsibility? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did people get the question? Okay, so let me start with that. So basically, do every country carries the same responsibility in terms of the situation we find ourselves on climate change, somewhat related a little bit to what you said. So within the UN Climate Change Framework Convention, UNFCCC, it is recognized, it's not me saying it, it's recognized that developed countries who historically have burned significantly more amounts of carbon and other greenhouse gases carry a bigger responsibility for the problem. So in the language of the UNFCCC, they talk about common and differentiated responsibilities. By common responsibilities, say all countries, irrespective of history, have to be applying themselves. And then the differentiated responsibilities are around, like, so for example, the Green Climate Fund, something that we fought very hard for a long time within the Climate Convention, and was one of the things we secured in Paris, the Paris climate negotiations in 2015, does actually recognize that rich countries need to put money into that fund to help poor countries with adaptation. Adaptation could mean building of walls to prevent sea level, the sea washing over, and changes in agriculture and so on. So bottom line is, it's recognized in the climate negotiations that, in fact, the countries that carry the historical emissions, and we can calculate it, by the way, yeah? It's not like a mystery. We can say the United States so much historically, China so much historically, and so on. So I kind of agree there's differences, but I think moving forward now, the differences will become less and less important because, I mean, not from a funding perspective. And let's just be clear. Those of us from so-called developing countries, we're not asking for charity from rich nations when we're saying you should put money into the thing. We are saying pay your climate debt, pay your carbon debt. This is about redress. This is not about, charity. In fact, I was talking to a Canadian newspaper boardroom, and I was like talking about that it's not fair that people in Africa are the ones who are paying the first and most brutal price, even though they have been least responsible for emissions. And this journalist was looking for like a sexy title for his article, and he said, "Oh, you're saying Canadians are killing Africans?" I said, no, I didn't say Canadians are killing Africans. And then he kept pushing me. He said, no, think about what you're saying. That is the effect of what you're saying. You are saying that the choices that we have made historically and presently to meet our energy needs has directly, contributed to the catastrophe that you are facing on the continent. And I said, well, some of those decisions were made when the science was not clear. We should not go into that kind of thing because it tends to fragment rather than unite. But for true unity, global unity to happen, we cannot sanitize the truth. And we cannot stand, we can't stand and say that slavery, we know who did slavery, how slavery was done. We know who did colonialism. We know how it was done. We can't wipe out that history of which parts of the world did those crimes, right? But we also, so we cannot forget the history, but we cannot also allow that history to strangulate us to death. Okay, so that's the only distinction I'd made. So, a very good question about young people and the institutions. I can say that I'm critical of how formal progressive civil society organizations have actually created spaces for young people to actually lead. I feel very strongly that if we say to governments, to our leaders, do 2 5-year terms and leave, people like me who become heads of organizations like Greenpeace should also apply that same rule. Those of us who are in leadership positions need to be making specific efforts to actually create opportunities for young people to lead. And let me just be quite clear that it's not about capacity development, right? Young people do not need their capacity developed in any fundamental way. We in the adult leadership need to allow capacity to be released, right? And so when I was at Greenpeace, we started a whole kind of big training program for the talented young people in Greenpeace and to fast track them into leadership and so on. But I'll be honest with you, it's always, too slow. Not everybody is always on board and so on. So that's a fair challenge, and I would endorse the challenge to myself and to anybody else who gets into leadership. And let me just say the good news about Africans Rising. So I was the volunteer, I'm a volunteer launch director. And so the interim board was saying, no, Kumi, you must stay for 2 years, consolidate it, make sure it's firm and so on. And I said, no, that's not helpful. We need to get young people to come in. So we made a decision, even though legally we couldn't formally put it in the advert because of human resources laws and so on. And I'm happy to say to the brother with the hat that a young Gambian gentleman called Lamin Mohammed Sadiqien has been appointed. He was very instrumental in getting Jammeh to eventually leave Gambia. So then on the capitalism, oh no, you were talking on capitalism. So, on the economic system, what I would say is that what Martin Luther King said was a critique of capitalism, basically, right? What we need to do in the current context is recognize that the economic system is broken. It is completely broken. And you're absolutely right that the economic system, if we don't address it, we stand a very slim chance of fundamentally addressing the question of climate change. However, the way we address it, we need to be very, this will sound very conservative to some of you. We almost have to see the humanity of the people who are capitalists, right? Because there's two ways we can try and destroy everything and so on, and I'm completely opposed to that, right? We have to figure out how do we transition ownership models and so on. Many of those ownership models are yet to be clarified and so on, and I hope people like you, in the academic work and the activist work that you do, can help provide solutions, but there are very few people in the world today who would stand up and say, yeah, capitalism, way to go, because, there was a time in the 80s, after the Berlin Wall came down and there was this rise of neoliberalism and all, to be a CEO, you could be very proud. Today, there's very few CEOs who have any sense of pride. And I've had the privilege or burden, depending on how you look at it, of engaging with them for the last 15 years as an activist. And I can tell you that many of them in private conversations will concede that the system is broken. And climate change is telling them that their own self-interest is under threat, right? Because if places get destroyed, there's no markets. And if ultimately their actions destroy the world, they don't want that to be the legacy. So I have a lot of sympathy with that. So on technology has a major, major role to play. But all I would say is that we have to be careful that we do not see technology as a panacea for everything, right? I think the best solutions right now are coming from the technological space. We need to invest in it, and we have to be creative. However, there are some dangers also we need to watch. Like, somebody like Bill Gates thinks everything is a technological fix, including climate change, where he wants to shoot these geoengineering things into the atmosphere and so on, which are so pie in the sky and so expensive. I'm not opposed to us trying anything new, but we can't go and use the most expensive, untested ways of addressing the problem when we have not explored to the full extent the tested and known ways of addressing the problem. So, because one of the big questions is, how do you suck the carbon that's already there out, right? Because yesterday I was talking to a taxi driver who was saying, you guys need to develop a solution to suck the carbon. Because see, once the carbon is released, it's there for a long time. But you can't. Now, I don't know whether such a technology will ever be existed, but we know that there are cheaper, clearer things to be done. But all those cheaper, clearer things to be done needs technology. Whether it's more energy efficiency in our appliances at home, whether it's energy efficiency in how we think about buildings and how you can use technology and so on. And of course, just to say that story about the buses and the young girls in Nigeria, that's a technology story for me, right? Figure about the shit in the urine. It is technology at the center of it. So folks, thank you very much for your questions. Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to being with you all at dinner tonight. I would just like to leave you with these words, which are on the tombstone of my friend Lenny. It says, "We shall walk this way but once. Any good, therefore, that we can do, or any kindness we can show to our fellow human beings, let's do it now. Let us not neglect it, postpone it, or defer it, because in all likelihood, we may never walk this world again." Thank you very, very much, and I wish you a great conference.
All right. I'd like to thank everyone who asked those insightful questions, and I'd like to thank Kumi for his equally, if not more, insightful answers. Now, we at ISWI, we share a lot of Kumi's beliefs here. We agree that climate change is a big issue. We agree the best time to do something is now, and we agree that some of the best people to do it are gathered here. As part of this, in this line of thought, we have decided, as far as this conference goes, maybe to offset the climate impact of so many people flying in and traveling here, that we will provide mostly vegan food during the conference, with some exceptions. This will minimize the environmental impact and help in that regard. Now, I hope you enjoyed Kumi. If you want to hear more from him, you will hear later at the opening ceremony beginning at 8 p.m. Be there by 7:30 p.m. He will also be giving a 10-minute address, as well as other people and many cultural events as well. And then after that, the opening concert by Banda Internazionale. We hope to see you all there. Thank you very much. We have a couple of gifts for Kumi here. First of all, from the Arabic shop, we have a shop that sells Middle Eastern and Asian specialities, run by some refugees that have come to this area, and they sell baklava, which we have here, and we have Club Mate. I don't know if you know Club Mate. Do you know it? It's a German caffeinated drink that we all really like. We call it ISWI Fuel, I guess. It really helps us organize.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Hope it'll help you deal with the jet lag. Thank you very much.